Greg Muller is stuck up in the Bay Area with the storms that have been coming through. I don't know if you guys have seen on the news that pretty much everything was grounded at SFO, and I think he managed to get home but did not manage to get down here. So we will be having some virtual engagement in our panel today, which works out okay, I guess. So I want to introduce Derek Muller, who is Associate Professor of Law here at Pepperdine University, whose research focuses on election law, particularly federalism and the role of states in administering the election. He has written work that's appeared in the Arizona Law Review, Indiana Law Journal, and about 8 other law journals that all end in the word law journal. He teaches election law, civil procedure, complex litigation, administrative law, and evidence here at Pepperdine, and has a BA from Hillsdale College and a JD from Notre Dame. So, Derek, if you want to take over and introduce your panel, we'll get started.
Be great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. In the legal world, we often are dealing with boots on the ground facts, and I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the discussion today as we transition from sort of all the pre-election day stuff to election day itself. So the focus of this panel is going to be on election day technology. So probably a lot of our minds jump to one of two things, thinking about Russians hacking our elections or online voting. But hopefully we're going to have a broad discussion on a number of issues, current events, cross-cutting on a number of areas of security and privacy concerns. We'll open with some comments from Greg Muller, and Greg is with us virtually, so testing our own technology today. He's the co-founder and chief development officer of OSET Initiative, a nonprofit election Technology Research Institute, and he served on the Congressional Internet Caucus Advisory Committee, the San Francisco Voting Systems Task Force, and a number of other areas of election technology. After that, we'll hear from Joe Kiniry. He's the CEO and chief scientist of Free and Fair. He's taught at the Technological University of Denmark, IT University of Copenhagen, the University of College Dublin, and he has his PhD from Caltech. Then we'll hear from John Patrick. He's the president of Attitude LLC. He's also the author of the book, Election Attitude. So hopefully you've gotten a signature from him, or we'll get one from him after this panel. He's the former vice president of Internet Technology at IBM. He has electrical engineering, management, and law degrees, and serves on a number of foundations and boards, including the OCLC, IEEE, and others. And finally, we hear from Steve Trout. He's the director of election innovation at Ballot. He served on the Election Assistance Commission's Future of Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. He's the former Oregon Director of Elections. He's advised the California Secretary of State, San Bernardino County officers, and the like. So we'll just go down, and Greg, assuming you can hear us, we'll open with you.
Thank you. Yes. Assuming you can all hear me as well.
Yes, we can.
Great. And good, Joe, and I'll just say next when I need to. Okay, well, thanks to the Davenport Institute for having me participate, however virtually now as it is. You heard early fall weather is attacking the West Coast here from San Francisco north. So I'm going to open with a few comments about us and where I think we are. As you heard, we are a nonprofit election technology research institute in the Silicon Valley based in Palo Alto. Got our start in November of 2006. We're rapidly approaching our 10th anniversary. We're comprised of a bunch of social entrepreneurs down there who come from several companies names you would recognize, mostly Apple, Netscape, Facebook, and Mozilla. We're undertaking a public digital works project to create publicly available election technology that can hopefully redefine a business model and help unstuck a very stuck industry. A couple of us at OSET are also serving as subject matter experts to the administration and Congress on election processes, technology, and public policy, given this particular election cycle has brought us a lot of energy and interest around the integrity of the systems. I imagine today's discussion could take any number of avenues. My hope is that a path we'll spend more time on than others is really the future of our electoral infrastructure versus any particular aspect of it. But with that said, I'll kick this off with a few comments about where the U.S. stands, and I'll say a few things about the work at the Trust the Vote project, which is sort of the flagship effort of the OSET Institute. So next slide, Joe. So the primary problem is election technology is a backwater of government IT. I don't think there's any other way to say it. We've reached this dysfunctional crossroads in part by enabling legislation, the Help America Vote Act of 2002, that resulted in computerized voting machinery in 2005. Today, for the most part, 3 vendors control over 80% of America's voting infrastructure, highly concentrated market. Machines introduced in 2005 remain largely in production. Over a dozen states will still rely on machines that have no paper ballot of record. Innovation in this space amounts to a discussion of spare parts from Asia and operating system software patches from Eastern Europe. No kidding. The common operating system for this machinery, and we're not making this up, is largely Windows 2000 with some Windows XP and Windows ME sprinkled in just for grins and giggles. So the problem here is that jurisdictions are typically resource constrained and cash strapped, and accordingly, there's really no commercial incentive to innovate. Next. So we're now at a crossroads. Thanks to yeoman effort of elections directors, administrators, and officials, and a national patchwork of systems will hang together for one more presidential election. But the morning after November 8th, we're pretty confident that the trending hashtag will be never again. By 2020, indeed, by 2020, the vast majority of the nation will need to be on a fresh platform. And how we get there is not going to be very simple. Next slide. So we view the ecosystem of democracy through what we call a 5P model: people, process, platform, policy, and politics. And one good reason we're 10 years into a project we honestly thought would take us 2 years has very little to do with the platform. That is the technology itself. All of these elements comprise the world of election administration, and they're uniquely interconnected. The newer model is actually 3-dimensional with bubbles. This diagram does it no justice. And people, we're finding, are really the underlying foundation of this all. And that said, next slide, no surprise, our focus at the OSET Institute is on the technology. Did you flip slides there? Okay, and holistically, the entire ecosystem from voter registration through ballot design, layout, generation, election management systems, casting, counting, tabulation, results reporting, and analytics. So really the whole schmaghetti of that ecosystem. And when we began thinking about this from the ground up, starting with the data model, we began to realize that a good model framework was an operating system. Thus, our next slide, you'll see that what we're building is a 21st century democracy operating system. We're doing that by separating out the software layer from the hardware, making that software layer a public asset, and catalyzing a new business model of systems integration. Where off-the-shelf hardware will be married to Electos with local adaptation, delivery, deployment, service, and support, all provided by commercial vendors. Next slide. So if we're successful, our goal, if we execute correctly, is that Electos will be for voting machinery what Android is as an operating system for digital devices. That's a loose metaphor that we use because we're not truly building an operating system, but again, it's a way of thinking. Next slide. So our mission, really driven by the input of over 200 election officials from across the country, is threefold: increase integrity, lower costs, improve usability. The objective is to produce technology that meets or exceeds the so-called VAST mandate, an acronym that for the technology and the elections that are delivered means something that's verifiable, accurate, secure, and transparent in process. Next slide. Our manifesto is really simply these 3 words, and our strategy is delivery. We have about 18 months of solid work left to produce a candidate voting system for certification, along with other collateral components like EMS, et cetera. Next slide. And we're making good progress. We've done a lot of work in voter registration systems and services. We've been helping with data standards development. Another area of focus for us has been on elections data reporting and analytics through a project called VoteStream, a component of Electos that's funded by the Knight Foundation. We have several outside corporate collaborators, underwriters, and supporters, including companies like Amazon Web Services, HP Labs, and we'll be announcing more soon. For security and integrity engineering, which is at the heart of what we're doing, we're collaborating with a company called Free and Fair. We have a representative there today, and Galwa. And in terms of user experience, something that's very near and dear to our hearts, our roots are in Apple, Netscape, and Mozilla. Our interactive design team is comprised of Apple alumni. Next slide. So in sum and substance, we're taking this mission very seriously in terms of cost reduction. And we firmly believe that Electos can ultimately bring costs down by nearly 2/3. Next slide. And that's pretty important. There's a Wharton industry study coming out next month that we were a part of, a 7-month study to really assess the industry and its state. Where is it and why is it so seemingly stuck? We know from the bottom up that the cost to replace every single machine in this nation would be about $3 billion. So getting that cost down is a big deal. So while there are a great many things we want to look at just over the horizon, whether it's internet voting or whatever, the immediate goal for us is open standards, open data, open source election technology platform that can be readily adopted and adapted and will be as broadly open and compliant as possible so that anyone's ballot marking device or counter or tabulator can plug in. A whole new world of apps can be created, and cutting edge tools like Clear Ballot, something you'll hear about today, could seamlessly plug and play with this. Last slide for me. And that's the mission and work of the OSET Institute and the Trust the Vote Project. And I hope that we have time today to talk really about how do we innovate the infrastructure in general. I've said enough, and I'll yield to my colleagues.
Great, thanks. And Joe.
Afternoon. What should I say? My name is Joe. Some of you know me. Kiniry, if you need to remember how to say it. Can I really say it? Kiniry. I am a reformed professor entrepreneur who got involved with election systems in 2000. I grew up in Florida. I saw what happened. I said, computers can fix this because I'm an engineer. And then about 30 minutes later, I figured out how interesting elections were. I was always a political wonk, so it was a natural thing to tend towards, but that got me hooked on thinking about solving problems in elections ever since. Over the years, I held academic posts in several countries in Europe. First, I was in Holland, and for some magical reason, they killed all their crappy voting equipment. And then I moved to Ireland, and for some reason, they killed all their crappy voting equipment. Are you starting to see a trend here? And then I moved to Denmark, and they stopped before they actually spent the money on crappy voting equipment. And then I moved back to the USA 3 years ago. Now, I'm an entrepreneur historically. I've done a number of companies over the years, raised money, sold them off, etc. And I always wanted to solve problems in elections. But the elections market sucks. There's not much money in it. It's glacial in its behavior. It takes forever for RFPs to come out and for there to be actual competition and the like. And so I decided, well, I have to wait for the right time to start a company, to do what I do, to impact the world for good. I still have my public good hat on. I still feel like I'm a public employee. This last year, so moving back to the USA, I came to a company called Galois. At Galois, we mainly work on matters relating to national security. So my clients are the Department of Defense and other 3-letter agencies. And so for the most part, I spend my time thinking about crazy things about cryptography and distributed systems and nation-state actors, that kind of fun thing. And so we've taken the goodness that is Galois and our expertise there and combined it with my 15 years of work as an academic and created a new company called Free and Fair. Free and Fair is a public benefit corporation, so it's for-profit and employee-owned, but it's meant to build open source elections technology for all. So it's the corporate counterpart to something like OSET or, for example, our friends at Democracy Works, all of whom we like a lot. The thing that makes us different is that not only is our technology open source, but our business practices are open source as well. We are publishing at the moment, for example, every RFP response we've ever made, every piece of advice we've ever given to a government. And our pricing is trivial and transparent. We're trying to help shift the market by what we call embarrassing transparency. This is what we're up to today, and I'm happy to talk about that and other things. There's one thing I'll note, that we feel like this panel might be contentious. I don't intend it to be so. I am an evidence-based guy. That being said, we should have an entertaining time talking about things like internet voting or blockchain or whatever crazy ideas you guys want to ask about. I will say that I have, how shall I put it, deeply examined most vendors' currently equipment. Some of it's behind my desk at work. I have done quality audits on a number of internet voting systems over the years. So I have strong opinions about those topics. But I'm also an engineer and problem solver and have published papers in the area. So I try to think towards the future and be constructive. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is John. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the first time I've ever been to an election conference or civic conference or anything related to that. I guess you could say I'm an outsider. I hope my perspective, which clearly will be a bit different, is of some value to you. I voted for the first time in 1963, 53 years ago. This year, I won't vote. It's not a political protest. It's our broken election system, which has failed me. Like Joe, I have roots in Florida. Although I'm living in Connecticut right now, I vote by absentee ballot to Florida. Florida has a law that they send out their ballots 30 days before the election. This year they were going to do it one day better and mail them out last Friday, the 7th. And then came Hurricane Matthew. Flagler County shut down. Monday was a holiday. Tuesday, they mailed the ballot. It will arrive in Connecticut today or tomorrow. I'm going from here to Southeast Asia for 3 weeks, and I'm coming back on Election Day to see my ballot, which will not be counted. I suppose I could fax it if I wanted to give up my privacy. I don't know if they allow it or not. They probably do. But the way I look at it, it's a lost vote. Unfortunately, I'm not alone. There are millions of lost votes, millions. In 2012, when the population was 314 million, there were 241 million people over age 18. When you make the adjustments for people that are incarcerated and overseas and so on, there were 223 million people who could register. And of those, 153 million registered and 129 million voted. In other words, there were almost 100 million people who didn't vote. 70 million of them didn't register. Registration systems are getting a lot better. It's definitely moving online. Huge surges. You may have seen the news about Texas adding a very large number of people through their campaign. So registration is moving very rapidly, but the voting part is not. We rank number 31 out of 34 developed countries in the world in terms of our voter participation. In that last presidential election, there were about 30 million people who were registered but didn't vote. Why didn't they vote? Well, some may have political reasons, a protest, or they just didn't care. Some, however, may have had other problems. Perhaps they had a disability, or were elderly, or were sick, or couldn't get the day off from work, or had obligations to their children or their parents, and so they didn't vote. Some people voted, but the vote wasn't accurately counted. Now, I must say that the election workers, and I've met quite a few of them in my research for the book, are incredibly dedicated, tireless, loyal, wonderful people. But the system that they're holding together with baling wire and Scotch tape is old, as was pointed out by Greg. Machines running Windows 2000 do not give you a lot of confidence. Some machines hiccup when a crease in a ballot goes through the scanner and it records the vote for the wrong person. Some people don't know to fill out the oval. They put a circle around the oval or a line under it or an X through it, and none of those votes count. In Palm Beach County in 2000, the ballot was so confusing that 19,235 people voted for Bush and for Gore, both. So, of course, those ballots didn't count. The concept of a radio button, only one of which can be clicked, does not exist on paper. So we have a system that really needs to be modernized. Now, how do we modernize it? Well, there's a tremendous effort that Greg described. I think it's wonderful, and my colleagues here on the panel are doing some great work. There's a lot of good things underway. In my mind, the answer to this set of problems is internet voting. I know a lot of people don't want to even talk about it, but it reminds me, frankly, of the mid-90s. In 1994, I gave a speech in Paris about my vision for the future of the internet and how it would impact our lives and how we would be able to do everything on the internet. The speaker preceding me was Bill Gates. Bill Gates said, I find the internet really interesting, but let's be clear about it. It's slow, it's unreliable, it's insecure, and it has no future role in business. That same month, I had lunch with an IBM fellow, PhD in computer science, a brilliant networking engineer at IBM, and I told him about my vision. He said, John, you just don't get it. The internet may be okay for reading documents, but it is not possible to do transactions with the internet. It can't be, it's impossible, it can't be done. I said, why is that? He said, because it has no state. In other words, it doesn't know the status of a transaction. He couldn't envision it, as smart as he was. Meanwhile, a 24-year-old at Netscape invented the cookie. And all of a sudden, we did have state. And the very next year, Amazon began selling books online. So a lot of this is vision and can we make it work? My colleague Vince Cerf, if you see on the back of my book, his quote is very elegant and simple. He says, we can do this. So are we ready to do internet voting right now? No. Do we have the infrastructure and the back end to make it work right now? No. But does it have to take 10 years or 20 years? No. If we can channel our energies, which currently are devoted to criticizing internet voting, I believe we can make it work in a verifiable end-to-end way that provides the privacy and the security that we all expect. I'm sure you'll have further questions about that. I'll stop at that point.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Steve Trout. I also want to add my thanks to the Davenport Institute and to Democracy Fund for this event and for all of you dedicating a day to definitely an important discussion topic. And I'm going to bring a little bit different perspective here. I want to talk about how these election tools are going to be used because as was said earlier, the pace of change is glacial. A lot of state governments are, still using, mainframe databases, and it's really hard to talk to them. Voting systems run in Windows 2000, and just a lot of old technology, and in fact, the standards for voting systems for certification are, they were just updated here this past year, but prior to that, the standard was 2005, and a lot of things have changed since 2005. But there is technology that is improving the election process, and I think we talked a little bit earlier today about voter registration. Online voter registration continues to grow, but it's almost been around for 10 years now, and so it's great. It continues to grow, but it's not happening fast and as fast as other things with technology are in the world we live in. I was part of kind of the review of our registration processes in Oregon, and the first couple of panels today talking about the lack of engagement and difficulty in registering, and so tried to flip the equation, recognizing that there's technology out there to be used that through integrating databases and taking data that governments already have to provide for the automatic registration of voters. It's starting to catch on. What started out as pretty much a bureaucratic process to gain efficiencies and improve processes, unfortunately, has turned political. So I don't know if that will help or hinder things, or how it will impact the timing of things. but definitely there's technology there that has allowed us to do things with voter registration databases that we couldn't have 10 years ago. And so governments are starting to be able to put those into play. You know, one of the interesting things when we went to online registration in Oregon, a lot of the third-party voter registration drive people continued to go out and pass along the paper, even though they could go out with a tablet, go out and have people register right there on the spot, because their main motivation was gathering the data from those forms and the people that were registering. And if they had them register online on a tablet, they weren't going to be able to collect the information that was on those paper forms. And so that's, as we talk about technology and bringing it into the election world, those are things that we have to realize and anticipate that, okay, there's things going on out there that people are looking at more than just getting people registered to vote. There's political situations, there's precincting issues, all of that we want to look out for. One of the other things when we went to online registration, you know, those first couple weeks, the average age of people registering online was in the upper 40s, which surprised us all. We thought, okay, yeah, this is going to be the younger crowd that's going to do it. What we realized is that's because the way word was getting out was because we were putting out press releases that were on the TV news or in the newspapers and weren't going through social media. Once we started hitting things with social media, then that average age of people registering online dropped considerably. So it's really changing the paradigm as you go forward there. So as far as voting goes, I think you know, as has been said earlier, we need to move away from, you know, custom-built hardware solutions and you know, move to more modern solutions, off-the-shelf hardware that you know, is tested for other purposes. You know, at Clear Ballot, we use off-the-shelf scanners. 2 different vendors that we've tested with. It could be more if we test with them. There's no sense in us going out and becoming experts on how to scan pieces of paper when that's already out there. And so we're able to take that tool, put our software on there, and be able to have a much more effective, efficient, transparent voting system. You know, in addition to that, we've heard a lot today about trust, and in my mind, the way you gain trust in elections is to provide transparency. I think we're all trying to be more transparent and provide more, you know, a better show of what's out there. We've been able to use technology to come forward and actually cut out the filled-in ovals of every ballot so that people could go and count the votes themselves. The Florida situation that was talked about earlier, where people circle the candidate instead of filling the bubbles. We not only look at the oval, we also look at the entire box, so that then we can go back and or the election officials can then go back and be able to review those that, you know, normally would only be seen in a close election. We've had situations with the use of the product where, you know, really close election, people have come in like 12 votes apart, and we're getting ready to ask for a recount. We were able to show them the actual images of the ballots, the ones that were circled, or the overvotes where things were filled in. Gave them full access to those images, and they walked away without asking for the recount. You know, they weren't happy, but they were content and had confidence that the vote was accurate. And so I think that's something valuable that new technologies can bring to provide transparency and help people gain confidence in what they're doing. One of the other things that you know, along that same vein is using equipment that people are comfortable with. I think this is especially valuable for those voters needing an accessible solution that have accessibility issues. One of the things that we were able to do in Oregon was to bring in tablets for people to use instead of custom-made devices. We spent millions of dollars on devices, and you know, I think only 30 people voted on them in 1 year, and it was just insane. And so, talking to people, it's like, well, how do you bank? How do you grocery shop? It's like, I do it on my iPad. I do it on my tablet, and you know, it's like, well, let's look into that. The nice thing about that is the features continue to improve they continue to get upgraded through the operating systems of those tablets. Whereas if we were doing that with custom-made hardware, we'd have to go out for every election or every time there's a new innovation and update that system and go through and create the code. So it, again, let's election officials take advantage of tools that are already out there, and then just lets them use those and have them applied during, for election purposes. So, you know, the budgets involved, the attention provided for elections, we're never going to be the cutting edge leaders on the grandest, greatest new technology in the history of the world. And so I think the future is, and what we're trying to do is trying to take proven technology that's out there, that's much more modern than jurisdictions have today, and then combining that with custom election-based software, so that then you can continue to you know, have things that people are used to using, things that are proven. We don't have to spend the time and resource researching scanner technology. We can use different components and different parts to allow ballots to be counted, and then again to provide that transparency that people can see. Yeah, this is how people vote. Mark ballots, really? You mean they'll put smiley faces in the circle instead of filling it in, or they'll put check marks, or they'll circle it? It lets us show those pictures and then tell the story. And so I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where election technology is going to lead the world in the latest and greatest things. But at the same time, I think we can use technology that's proven today to improve the administration of elections without having to be 10 or 20 years behind the times.
Well, thank you so much. I want to open with I have two questions, so I hope people in the audience start thinking about some other ones. I'd like to focus first not on the internet-based question, but on just sort of the technology that happens in the precinct or at the polling place on election day. That we've identified some barriers to that. Part of it might just be cost, but others might be the sluggishness of legislators or low priorities. I mean, what do you view as the biggest barrier to upgrading our election technology, and how feasible is it that we can sort of overcome that in the near future?
Lack of money.
If we had money, it would solve it.
No,
I don't.
I mean, there's no funding. I mean, the federal government does this in many instances. They'll agree on some need, usually after a crisis. They'll allocate a lot of money to apply to it in the short term and provide no funding for the maintenance of that over time or the subsequent replacement. So the precincts are stuck with old machines. You have poll workers hanging out on eBay trying to find PCMCIA cards, which I introduced with the ThinkPad at IBM in 1992. You know, it's a dire situation, and I don't have a good answer for how all those machines are going to get replaced. The money isn't there to do it. In the long haul, what Greg described and some of the ideas that I've written about are going to come to play. But in the short term, I don't have a good answer. Maybe Joe does.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's more than money. Obviously, that's a huge issue. But I think even if we had unlimited funds, I think there's a political component, you know, to the 5 points they had up there. One of the most idealism crashing experiences I had early in my career when I was working in the California legislature on the elections committee, or with the elections committee, was people didn't want to change a statute because that's the one they were elected under, and they knew what those rules were, and if the statute got changed, they weren't sure how that was going to impact whether they were going to get reelected or not. And I think I've seen that throughout my career. I think it's an unfortunate reality, but I think it is, you know, I think it's one of those, we'll take the devil that we know over something that's unknown, especially for people whose jobs are dictated by whether they can win or lose an election. And as we've heard throughout today, campaigning is changing, and that's scary when you're not exactly sure how that's going to change and how it's going to impact whether you win or lose.
All right, and the second is internet voting. So we do everything online, right? We do all our banking online, our shopping online, we do everything online. What is it that is so problematic about us transferring from this sort of on election day we physically go to a place where we physically hand in a ballot into the electronic space. Is it just the political will, or do we have the technology problems that are sort of insurmountable at the moment that we're trying to overcome, despite the fact that we do so much else online? What is it about internet voting that seems so difficult?
Flip a coin? Or you want
No, I want to hear your
I think that was the last. I think that was the last question for this panel.
Well, there are a lot of issues associated with internet voting, no question about it. And on the other hand, there is evidence that it can work. And there have been successful pilots in Arizona, in Utah, in West Virginia, with the military, and others. Estonia has been providing online internet voting for more than 10 years with no security issues. Now, admittedly, they have a national ID, which makes it a little bit easier, actually makes it a lot easier. But when we have the military, which is one of the most emotional parts of the issues that I talked about, in 1967, I was in the Army, and that year, 54,000 American soldiers were killed. There were many, many more than that overseas. They couldn't vote. In 1986, President Reagan signed a bill that said, fix this. And here we are 30 years later, and it still isn't fixed. And there are ways to do this. Alabama has just been now the first state to introduce real-time online voting, click here to vote for this person system for the military overseas. So I believe it can be done. There are a lot of issues that people talk about, but there are ways to solve these issues. It is possible. How could it not be possible? If we can put a piece of equipment on Mars and take pictures, we can't figure out how to use the internet to be able to vote. Now, I realize there are issues that it's different than e-commerce. It is different than e-commerce. And the difference is that if somebody steals your credit card or breaks into your Amazon account and buys something, you'll know it and you can reverse it. If somebody breaks into your whatever you use to vote on the internet and steals your vote, then you won't know it. That's a valid argument. But my point of view, and I'll stop with this point, is that comparing internet voting to a perfect system, which we will never, ever have, is the primary dialogue that I observed in my research for this book, is a comparison between internet voting and a perfect system. No comparisons between internet voting and what we have today, which is terrible and is not accurate. And it is disenfranchising to millions of people. We can do better. So so what your question, Derek, was, what's holding it back? There's no political will. If you look at congressmen between 1964 and 2014, their re-election rate is 93%. That's their priority, to stay elected. They have very good jobs with free parking and great pensions and other things. And so they don't necessarily want it to be easier to vote. So there's no political will pushing it. And at the same time, there's a lot of critics of internet voting. There are no proponents of internet voting. I hope to change that, to attract more people to this point of view and try to deflect some of the criticism energy, which is abundant, into more constructive energy to say, today on the plane coming out here, I read this article, 7 ways to hack the election system. Why couldn't there be an article that says 7 things you can do to prevent your server from being attacked? So it's a perspective. It's an attitude. That's why I called the book Election Attitude. Go for it, Joe.
I hope I have a good attitude. I've been trying to solve problems for a long time. Internet voting is like the moonshot of interesting problems, right? It has all kinds of interesting aspects to it. Earliest papers on internet voting go back over 20 years now. People have been working on this in academia. And I would say we do have some proponents of it. I mean, there's 4 main vendors that have large piles of money and are trying to get business. Smartmatic has a brand new system that they just put out 10 days ago that is purportedly end-to-end verifiable. We don't know because they didn't actually publish any of their protocols or papers, but maybe we'll get there. Dominion has a lot of money and has an internet voting system. Everyone counts, CITL and the like. So there's proponents out there. And John knows that I co-wrote a book last year called The Future of Voting, which is all about, what do we need if we want to have a nice, robust, end-to-end verifiable internet voting system. And it has like a checklist. You do these, whatever it is, 201 things, we'll give you a thumbs up. And I think what's happening now is vendors are paying attention to that, right? They're starting to use that nomenclature and going down the checklist. So I think that, I, like many folks who work on this topic, think that it could enfranchise, it could be very useful, it'll certainly enable certain classes of voters. And, good research has been going on, and I think more research should happen moving forward. I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, in fact, DARPA is now spending large piles of money on certain aspects of the problem today. I mean, we at Galois are a performer on a distributed denial of service project. It's a $60 million project just to focus on that one topic. And you can't really have internet voting until you have some way to mitigate denial of service attacks. So I think there's lots of constructive work going on. That being said, I will say that if we want to look towards leading lights of folks doing constructive work in the area, I would not call attention to Estonia. I would not call attention to Australia. Those of us who have looked into those systems find that they don't have much foundation in good quality, shall we say. And if you're a technologist, I can show you some source code later that'll make you pee yourself in laughter. But there are other entities that are quite good that are working on this topic constructively. I would point out in particular a company called Verificatum out of Stockholm and a company called Invotes out of, I believe they're founded in Spain. Both of them are doing really quality work under peer review. They have proper cryptographers. They have open source code. So I think there's really constructive stuff going on, and I look forward to continuing to positively engaging with that constructive dialogue, I'll say.
If I could just make a point there. I think we probably agree more than we might think, Joe.
Yeah.
But, with regard to Estonia, many computer scientists have been highly critical of what they're doing over there.
Mm-hmm.
Estonians think it's great. The president of Estonia thinks it's great.
Yeah.
They don't have anywhere near the problems of disenfranchisement and errors that we have. And they don't have stacks of provisional ballots or military ballots or ballots that we know probably won't get counted. Mm-hmm. unless they have to be. How does that make you feel that, well, we have your vote, but we're not really going to look at it unless there's a tie? And the other point I'd like to make about internet voting is the 201-point checklist and the end-to-end verifiable internet voting paper, 127-page paper. I read it, and it has a footnote in it, and it says in that footnote that the system we have described may not be possible to be created. And so the way I look at that as a person involved in the beginnings of the web and e-commerce and so on, if we had taken that approach to e-commerce, there would be no Amazon today. We wouldn't be buying anything online because it would never be good enough. The history of the web is iteration, it's evolution, it's think big, act bold, start simple, and iterate fast. That's the mantra that I wrote about 15 years ago. It's still true, and it's still happening. Every day the internet gets a little better. And so let's start. Let's have pilots. I'm not advocating that we have a healthcare.gov. That would be the worst possible thing we could do. And of course, the Constitution makes it clear the states have the ball, so there's not going to be a federal system. And this is part of the problem, is the perception is that we read the press stories that say the election system getting hacked. There is no the election system. There's 10,000 precincts in 50 states that have the responsibility. So we have a lot of work to do on this, but as Vince Cerf said, this can be done.
Greg, I don't know if you're still with us. I just want to make sure if you have any comments on either the last two questions, and if not, we'll go to the audience for a Q&A.
No, that's fine. I've just been listening. I think it's certainly being covered.
Great. All right, so with that, to the audience.